This is the first video in a series that shows how to set up, configure, test, and debug the MVS Toolkit. Other than basic D3 knowledge, the only prerequisite is the MVSP configuration and debugging video series. If you somehow missed that one and aren't completely familiar with MVSP, please go watch those now. In this video, we'll cover the MVS Toolkit architecture. Other videos will cover installing the Toolkit client and server over Windows, installing the Toolkit server over Linux, configuring the Toolkit, testing the Toolkit, web service export and import, and debugging the Toolkit. Let's talk about the Toolkit architecture. First, it's important to note that the Toolkit works against both D3 and MVBase as multi-value server backends. For the purposes of this tutorial, we'll refer to the multi-value server as D3 for brevity. Just know that MVBase is fully supported as well. It's also important to note that the TCP ports shown in these examples are the defaults, but they are configurable. There are three components in play here. The first component is the D3 server, which listens and responds to requests using our multi-value server protocol, or MVSP as we call it, on TCP port 9000 by default. It can be D3 Windows, D3 Linux, D3 AIX, or MVBase. The second component is the web service provider, a small Jetty web server that acts as a middleman between D3 and the outside world. It listens for requests on TCP port 8181 by default and listens for configuration data on TCP port 3410 by default. It can be installed on Windows or Linux, but not AIX. This server does not need to be installed on the same server as D3, but it can and usually does reside on the D3 server, except of course for D3 AIX. For the purposes of this tutorial, we'll call this the Toolkit server. The third component is the Toolkit client, which is an Eclipse-based interactive development environment, or IDE as we call it, that reads and writes configuration data on TCP port 3410 by default. This component can only be installed on Windows. For the purposes of this tutorial, we'll call this the Toolkit client or client IDE. The Toolkit is built to publish D3 data as web services by taking HTTP requests from various sources like web service or phone apps, then interpreting those requests based on user-defined configuration parameters, then sending them to D3 using MVSP, then wrapping the D3 response into an XML or JSON object, then sending those objects back as responses to the requester via the same TCP port on which the request was made. The web service provider is configured using the Toolkit client IDE. The Toolkit client can configure multiple Toolkit servers running on either Windows or Linux. The client can also talk to multiple MV servers of any type. Again, D3 Windows, Linux, AIX, or MVBase. In the next video, we'll cover installation of the Toolkit. If you have any questions about any of the content we've covered so far, please contact Rocket D3 Support.